Well, I don't know if this makes your lives easier or harder, but the dates from this unit are actually very similar to the dates from the last unit. Basically, the works identified as Northern Renaissance date mostly from the 1400s, the period of the early Italian Renaissance, or 15th century, while the Reformation kicks in with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, which more or less coincides with the time of the High Italian Renaissance. I think another way and better way of looking at this timeline, though, is that the art we looked at in this unit is really all Northern Renaissance, with some of the later Renaissance artists embracing this new Protestant outlook and others not embracing it. I think viewing all this art as Northern Renaissance is a more useful way of thinking about this unit, and it shows you that the real question you need to grapple with is, how did the Northern Renaissance resemble and how did it differ from the Italian Renaissance? Now, I talked about that in my first Reformation podcast, and I'll reproduce those slides in just a minute. Get those distinctions down now, and you're on your way not only to getting a lot of multiple choice questions right, but also writing thoughtful essays. Now, it is important to remember that later 16th century art is created in the shadow of the religious wars. Basically, the Burgundian Empire, which existed toward the end of the 100 Years' War, falls. The Holy Roman Emperor is rising in power and is going to come into conflict with the Protestant societies in the north. I'm going to talk more about this in our next unit when we look at Baroque art in both Catholic and Protestant societies. So as threatened, here's a slide that I showed in my first Reformation lecture. I worry that some of you skipped that lecture. I would really encourage you to go back and look at it, not least because it also covers Albrecht Durer, who of all of the artists in this unit, except perhaps Jan van Eyck and Pieter Bruegel the Elder, is the one you most need to know. So here's my other and arguably even more important recap slide. Okay, I know I'm a real bore on this topic, but I continue to worry that many of you are counting on multiple choice wizardry to get over your essay writing reluctance or your insecurity. It's not a good strategy on the AP Art History exam. And actually, I think it's a lousy strategy for the rest of your life. Other than getting my driver's license renewed every 10 years, I have not had to take a whole lot of multiple choice tests since leaving college. But I had to write, and I had to write a lot. You've already had these 5 essays. They've been handed to you on Moodle. I'm going to pick 2 for the test, and I'll make a confession. Even as I'm recording this podcast, I haven't decided which 2. The other 3 will be available to you as extra credit options. So, behind door number 1 is a question from 1998. Sorry about the tiny photos, but you can see larger versions in the Word document on Moodle. The painting on the bottom is a work by Titian that you haven't seen before, but it's fairly easily identifiable as High Renaissance. It could probably be Baroque. The painting on the top is one you need to be able to identify. Note that this is basically a question asking you to compare the Northern Renaissance with the High Italian Renaissance. But let me hint, just to head off a potential problem, both are painted in oil. Titian, in fact, was a superb user of oil paint. So that's not a difference between the 2. Early Italian Renaissance paintings are often fresco. High Renaissance paintings, usually not. Okay, you have to know this artist, and his work is really not hard to recognize. To answer this question well, you need to go beyond the obvious point that these address religious themes and think about the specific religious preoccupations of the late Middle Ages. Why might the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse be a popular theme? Why did the image of a knight resonate? For that matter, what was happening to knights? I talked about that a little bit at the beginning of this unit. So dig into that question and try to move beyond the superficial in your response. Okay. The image on the right is not in your edition of the AP Art History textbook. I'm guessing it was in an earlier edition since this question is more than a decade old. But it may be not. I think probably what the College Board is getting at is that you should be able to recognize the Northern Renaissance characteristics of the work. And I'm going to help you out. The work is labeled here, so you can look it up. This is basically an Italian versus Northern Renaissance question, something you're very likely to get on the AP test. And you recognize the painting on the left from the Sistine Chapel, right? It's hard to miss Michelangelo's women. They all look like they're shooting up steroids. Back to power and authority. Now, with the rise of the new monarchies and powerful European nation states, this theme is going to reemerge in a big way. Not that it ever really disappeared. Again, the trick to answering this question well is to move beyond the superficial. Get some information about the painting, maybe about the king, since studying for the multiple choice questions is not going to be all that hard for this unit. Try to use some of the time you save prepping for the essays. Okay, there are only 12 general multiple choice questions on this unit exam, which tells me maybe we got lucky in studying this particular unit during such a crazy period in the school schedule. As I've already said, Durer is a figure you must know. And by the way, there are 3 good answers to that first question, but only one of them is going to be on the test and correct. The first question shows up twice in slightly different forms, so think maybe it's a College Board favorite. For the second question, you need to know what a genre painting is. If you do, I think or hope that the answer will be obvious. So who are the big genre painters from this unit? The third question is a repeat from an earlier exam, and it shows up on more than one AP test as well. To answer the fourth question, think about what the later Italian Renaissance painters borrowed from the North. And for the fifth question, just think weird, and you'll get it right. Know something about oil painting, okay? And for that matter, know the major characteristics of Flemish painting. That's van der Weyden, Van Eyck, etc. You should know their favorite subjects, their favorite medium, and this is really important, how they use iconography or symbols. So what's the name besides altarpiece for this kind of artistic work? And I'm really asking a structural question. You don't need to be able to identify this work. I just pulled it off the internet to, in fact, illustrate this particular structure. It was particularly clear. So, what was the destruction of images called in the Byzantine era and then again during the Reformation? This is a repeat question, but that's because this theme has become relevant again. So here are 2 details from the Merode altarpiece, by the way. The Merode altarpiece is another one of those must-know works, very likely to show up on an image-based question. So how does the artist employ symbolism? What kind of objects does he use? What do they represent? So who painted this? And similar visions of hell. That, again, I'm guessing that's an easy one. Now we're moving into the image-based question. So when was this work made and who made it? What kind of work is it? I mean, where did it appear? This is part of a cycle of works. What was the subject of this cycle? What art historical period is this? And be careful, the answer is not Renaissance. Think Simone Martini or Gentile da Fabriano. So what's happening in this painting? What other artist painted similar scenes? That could be kind of confusing, but you'll get it right if you realize that this, too, is a genre painting. I told you needed to know this guy. So what medium is the work? What was the chief advantage of this medium? What is the nationality of the artist? The figures reflect this artist's fascination with what other art forms? Get that right. To get that right, just remember that he was very much a man of the Renaissance and had Renaissance interests. So these plants and animal forms show a very detailed naturalism. That's similar to what other artists, and again, this is going to be a Northern Renaissance artist from the period we're studying, a big name. Think of somebody who did exquisite detail. What's the source of the subject of this work? This is really easy as long as you know what the subject is. If you get this one wrong, I may report you to the theology department. So this artist signed his name. What is the significance of that act? This artist not only produced great works, but he also wrote extensively about art. So what were among his many interests? As I've said, this artist is one you need to know thoroughly. Another reason for watching that first Reformation podcast if you haven't already. Okay, by the way, the upper image appeared on your last unit test. I left out the questions about the lower image because we hadn't studied it yet. But in fact, on the actual AP exam, they appeared together. So both works depict what biblical scene? Both date from what art historical period? This is going to be a more general term this time. What kind of work is the painting on top? In other words, how is it made? I think that's a repeat question, but it's one you should still know the answer to. For whom was it made and who was the artist? This is back from the early Italian Renaissance. If you need to go look it up again. Very popular work, very important work, one you need to know. And now we turn to the work on the bottom. As I said, this is a work you really have to know. So what's the medium? And what kind of work is it? In other words, this is another question about its structure. Get the feeling that's something else, another term the College Board wants you to know. Okay, another must-know work. So who painted this painting? In what century? This is, again, usually for the AP exam, you don't need specific dates, but you have to have a general sense of the century. Where did this artist primarily work? What city? What are important elements of this painting that are typical of Northern Renaissance painters? Okay, so there have been many interpretations of what this work might mean, what it signifies. So what are they? As you probably guessed, this is an accept question. How did the artist include himself in the painting? By the way, that's a little tricky because actually there's more than one possible answer. That's another thing that art historians dispute over. There's one answer that's clearly correct, and at any rate, only one possible answer will appear on the test. So good luck. From here, we move on to the Baroque.